This gross, like even darker than usual turn from the Republican nominee comes at a very late moment in the presidential campaign. And it comes at a time when something that we can't ignore is raising its head again in their political circles. And that, I can't even believe I have to say this, but it's part of the news cycle again from them. It's Holocaust denial. And I say it's come up from them again because, of course, we had Trump host a dinner for rapper Kanye West after West said he was going DEFCON 3 on Jewish people and started posting swastikas online. Mr. West's dinner companion was a self-avowed Nazi with a large online following. We then recently had a major point of awkwardness between the Trump campaign and one of their largest donors. Remember when Trump said the Medal of Honor was a bad thing because members of the military who received that highest military honor that we give as a nation, they've usually been shot or killed in defense of their country by the time they received that award? Do you remember the context of why he said that? The reason he said that, the riff that led him to that, is because he was saying the Medal of Honor is bad compared with another medal that he said was better. Because the other medal he said was better was the one he had given to his billionaire donor, Miriam Adelson. Why was he talking about the fact that he gave Miriam Adelson that medal years ago? He didn't give it to her recently. He gave it to her when he was president. Why was he bringing that up now on the campaign trail? Because he was trying to make nice to her. He had to make nice to her because he wants her money for the campaign again this year. And he had to make something up to her because a bunch of text messages were leaked in which his running mate, J.D. Vance, talked smack about Mrs. Adelson and specifically her late husband. Those disparaging messages about the Adelsons were leaked to the press by the person to whom J.D. Vance sent the texts. This is a man who J.D. Vance was texting with a lot, including texting this man disparaging remarks about a famous Jewish Republican political donor. The man who J.D. Vance was texting with about that, the guy who leaked the messages to the press, is himself most notorious for being a Holocaust denier. And now Senator Vance is due to go do a big public event with a former Fox News host who just spoke at the RNC, who then followed that up with a big public-facing laudatory interview with yet another Holocaust denier, whom he praised as the best public historian in America. A man who says the United States fought on the wrong side in World War II, that Hitler was not the real bad guy in World War II, that Hitler has gone to heaven, and who has said that it's a myth that the Nazis ever really set out to kill the Jews. It is astonishing that Holocaust denial is not an accidental brush with this campaign, but something that keeps coming up over and over and over again. And it's not just something that's like outre or impolite. It's really consequential. And it's really worrying that this is a recurring thing in this presidential campaign. That this presidential campaign, that this presidential candidate keeps churning up new associations with Holocaust deniers every few weeks or months. Because why do people do this? What is Holocaust denial for? What purpose does it serve? Holocaust deniers don't think that there's been a big misunderstanding or that there's been sort of some good faith mistake about what really happened in history. What Holocaust deniers are contending is that a deliberate lie has been concocted to make us believe something that isn't actually true, to make us believe that the history we've been taught about what happened in World War II is a hoax perpetrated by the Jews to make Germany look bad when Germany doesn't really deserve that, when Hitler really wasn't so bad. Holocaust deniers say not only that the Holocaust didn't really happen, but the myth of the Holocaust was invented as a hoax to make Nazism and fascism look bad when really they're not bad at all. They're good. Right? That's the first level implication of Holocaust denial. And it's not only a bad and dangerous thing because it's an overt effort to rehabilitate Nazism and fascism and whitewash what is bad about those things. It's also bad because it entails a conspiracy theory about the world today, which ultimately demands that we get rid of democracy and get ourselves a strongman government instead. Because Holocaust denial isn't just, oh, I'm fuzzy on what really happened. It was a long time ago. Holocaust denial, particularly the kind being promoted by the guy who J.D. Vance is about to appear with, this variety of Holocaust denial is the contention that there is a conspiracy that is teaching you a lie, that is trying to make you believe a myth about some bad thing having happened to the Jewish people that didn't really happen. And why have you been taught this myth about a bad thing happening to the Jewish people when it didn't really happen? Well, that's the Jews who are teaching you that myth, because it serves Jewish interests, because Jews are so powerful and so conniving that they've invented this fake history and made us all believe it. The contention of the Holocaust deniers is that nothing bad actually happened to the Jews. But you've been manipulated into believing that it did, because Jews are secretly this unimaginably powerful cabal, and they're mind controlling us all for their own purposes, to get what they want. And what do they want? They want white Christians to look bad so that they can be in charge. They want to destroy the white race. They want to destroy Christianity. They want to rule the world. And the implication of this is that if there's a group that powerful conspiring against Christians everywhere, well, what could possibly stop them? Certainly there's no point in engaging in, democratic political processes, because, hey, if the real power is in the hands of this secret evil elite operating behind the scenes, then nothing you do in so-called politics is going to ever matter. The evil cabal will keep pulling the strings. So don't bother participating in politics. It's all a ruse. It's all a hoax. There's an evil conspiracy that's really running everything. In that formulation, democracy is for suckers, right? Democracy is naive and maybe even evil if it allows these evil, powerful groups like Jewish people to participate in democratic processes along us, the Christians, who are evermore their victims. So in the short term, right, before you rush to the eliminationist, murderous ends that Holocaust denial inevitably leads to, even before you get there, the consequence of perpetrating this stuff, the consequence of platforming this stuff, the consequence of telling these lies, of defining Jewish people as perpetrating a hoax against white Christians, or even of defining Jewish people as the secret power behind the government or culture or finance or whatever, the consequence of it, what you're telling people is that we should give up on democracy, because we're going to need to take extreme action against these very, 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 very all-powerful evil enemies within. So maybe we'll start with camps for millions of people and long prison sentences for everybody we identify as an enemy. And what did he say? It will be a bloody story. So none of this is good. I mean, happy birthday, North Korea. I wish you all the best. But none of this is good. We are heading into the first and likely the only presidential debate of this campaign, while the Republican ticket is not just led by a self-professed fan of the weirdest and worst dictators around the world, a self-professed fan of dictatorship itself. He is now promising at his rallies that there will be bloodshed. He is getting his crowds to laugh at deadly violence perpetrated against his political enemies. He has turned a skull fracture into a laugh line. He is promising to imprison his enemies en masse. He is telling his crowds that his supporters who have committed criminal acts of violence on his behalf, he will spring them all from prison because they are his martyrs. And now his running mate is about to go do a ticketed tour event with the most high-profile American media figure to have ever promoted Holocaust denial. Because Hitler wasn't really the bad guy in World War II, and by the way, the United States was on the wrong side of that fight. Welcome, Vice Presidential nominee J.D. Vance. With that as the Republican Party platform this year, heading into the first debate, the presidential race is tied between the two parties. And the character of the race on the Republican side, the de facto platform of the Republican Party here, is not just a little red flag here for danger. This is all the alarms going off all at once. There has never, ever been a presidential contest in this country with stakes like this.
Getting them out will be a bloody story. Should have never been allowed to come into our country. If you come back, you will be executed. You will be killed immediately. Not going to be easy, but we'll do it.
That was Donald Trump over the weekend, telling supporters his mass deportation policy will be bloody if he wins in November. And obviously, it's far from the first time that he's slipped shades of violent rhetoric into his speeches. With just 57 days to go until the election, and with one of the two candidates continuing to say things like that, I found a new book from CNN's Dana Bash particularly timely. History repeats. We always hear that. It tells the story of an election where candidates complained of corruption, violence broke out, and democracy was pushed to its breaking point. Sounds kind of familiar. But no, it's not about 2020 or 2024. It's about 1872. Joining me now is Dana Bash. She is CNN's chief political correspondent and the co-author of the new book, America's Deadliest Election, the cautionary tale of the most violent election in American history. First of all, congratulations. I have no earthly clue how you had time to write a book.
My co-author, David Fisher, is how.
You're a superhuman.
The amazing David Fisher. No, thank you so much for having me.
It's great to see you. So, I mean, this is such an interesting comparison. Most people don't know about the 1872.
I didn't. Did you know about it?
I did not. Louisiana gubernatorial election, but there are a lot of parallels. I mean, there was violent rhetoric. There was violence. It was quite, the country was bitterly divided. Election officials weren't giving up the outcome. They weren't observing the outcome. I wonder, as you hear language, and you've covered, obviously, Trump for many years, as you hear language like this weekend or the violent rhetoric that you hear from him more often than infrequently, does it remind you of 1872?
Yeah.
How do you compare it?
The parallels are uncanny in so many ways. One of the ways, Jen, is just with the sort of main character, if you will, who was the governor of Louisiana, Henry Warmoth, who was somebody who had character traits who are so familiar. And I'm just going to read you a couple of examples. People knew Warmoth was a crook, but remained fiercely loyal to him. Their allegiance to Warmoth defied description. It appeared they were willing to die or kill for him. The question was, why? They forgave him all of that. He understood them. He touched a part of them that only few others had reached. He was fighting for them, for the way of life they had once lived. Now, back then, that way of life this was during Reconstruction. It was pre-Reconstruction, pre-Civil War, when obviously slavery was very much in place. And so now what he was helping them fight for at that point was slavery wasn't going to come back, but they wanted to make sure that blacks didn't get power and change their way of life. And back then it was Democrats who were the segregationists and who were the just flat out racists. And so they were trying to do whatever they could to suppress the vote, the new black vote. And in Louisiana and other states, but this particular story is how they were successful in doing so. They realized the only way to keep society from changing so drastically was to make sure that blacks didn't vote, and they were intimidated, they were threatened, they were disenfranchised, and they were murdered, in some cases in a massacre.
There are so many racial comparisons, you just outlined them, to present day today as well, where we see with voter suppression around the country. You've answered it a bit there, but how do you look at those comparisons in terms of how rhetoric is used to kind of suppress the vote, to intimidate people, to make immigrants sound like they are bringing violence to our country? How do you compare this time to that time?
Again, very similar, very similar. There were discussions about rants, about people coming from the southern border back then, just as they are now. And, you know, it was started in 1872, and then it went up to 1876, which people might be a little bit more familiar with because of the parallels there between what happened then and 2021, when things were so bad in Louisiana and 3 other states that they sent 2 slates of electors to Washington. And there was a debate about what the vice president's role was. Was it something that is more ceremonial, or could the vice president choose the electoral slates? And they decided then it was ceremonial. But another familiar thing that happened back then, one of the riots in the streets of New Orleans erupted in chants, hang him, about the opponent that they were trying to stage a coup against. That was actually the rightly elected governor.
Very eerie.
Yes.
Now you're here and you have moderated the last debate. You also did the one interview with the presidential and vice presidential candidates. So you know a lot about these people, is my point. Neil Katyal was on earlier, and he's a great lawyer, a good friend, very smart. He made a point that I actually hear from people, friends on text chains, people who, when you go to events, why can't the moderators do more to fact check? Now, Trump is a different character, but you moderated the last debate. Why can't they? Shouldn't things change with Trump as a candidate?
I think Neil is brilliant, and I also have so much respect for him. But on the statement that he made to you, I disagree. And what he said was, it is the moderator's job to be a participant, basically, in the debate. And I totally agree when I'm doing an interview. I completely agree when I am maybe moderating a town hall, when the person who is trying to be an elected official doesn't have their competitor there. But if a moderator gets that involved in a debate, they are a participant in the debate. And look, all of this is a judgment call. It's not easy.
Bet not.
But it is a judgment call. And what we decided to do was follow the model that had been in place since Kennedy-Nixon, really, which is the moderators facilitate and you allow the candidates to debate one another, and in that case, fact check one another. I was just talking to Kevin Madden, who worked for Mitt Romney, and about this afterwards, and he said, "Oh, it's a slippery slope." Some people are very much against it, some people are very much for it, but I try to put myself in the position of, okay, let's say what happens when we do fact check. Then where does it end? How far does it go? Again, they are judgment calls. I'm not saying that it is not possible, but it's difficult. And you can be sure that the people who are saying fact check now are going to say, or maybe the other side, depending on how it goes, who is maybe telling the falsehood, will say, well, the moderator had their thumb on the scale. Now, we know what happens in a Trump debate. I'm not saying it's going to be equitable, but it doesn't make it easy.
Well, very few people have sat in that seat to know, which is the other thing to remember. You've also said that we should expect anything or everything tomorrow night, and
Absolutely.
I could not agree more. They've never met in person. They've never debated
weird?
each other. It's very weird. I can't stop thinking about it.
I can't either.
I know. It's wild. Dana Bash, I could talk to you forever. It's amazing. You have this new amazing book, America's Deadliest Election.
I think there has been over the past, I don't know how many weeks it's been, like 6 to 8 weeks since Vice President Harris became the nominee, that a lot of people have been wrapped up in the joy and wrapped up in just the sort of dream world of having this president. I mean, how cool would it be to have this amazing woman be president, forgetting that there is a large pool of Americans who do not want that dream. They really want to go back to Trumpism. And I think a lot of people really don't see how that could be, but it is real. What do you make of what it's going to take to get from the dream and the, sort of fun of the Harris-Walz campaign to an actual first woman president?
You hit the nail on the head. We're amazed that we're at this moment and America has an opportunity. But the fact is, it is and has always been a fight. I think that's the reason why the joyful warrior idea for Kamala Harris is very fitting. Yes, we need joy. Yes, we need some relief to the dark visions of Project 2025. But the reality is we have to work, and we have to work like we've never done before to overcome all the ways in which Trump and MAGA have made it difficult for democracy to function in the swing states. And so what I make of it is the debate is a moment for us to realistically assess what's happening, and particularly in battleground states, start sending legions of people to call and text and door knock and do everything that we can to turn out the vote. That's what we're in for the next 8 weeks. And it's the kind of thing where those of us who work in politics and understand that this kind of change is a generational change. It would usher in a new era, but it isn't like power is going to concede without a struggle. It is. We're in the moment of that struggle. And you couldn't have said it better. There's nothing more stark between a vision of the past and a vision of the future, and that we'll see tomorrow night at the debate.
Cornel, talk about the stakes here in terms of where the polls sit right now. We've seen this huge onrush of newly registered voters. You're seeing a lot of excitement for the Harris-Walz ticket among younger voters. The question is, do they wind up turning out in enough numbers to actually get what they want, which is this fresh new candidate? When you're looking at the polls, what are you seeing?
Well, they're connected, Joy, and so here's the thing. Here's where Joy does actually come in, right? You know, I'll go back to the presidential campaign of 2008, which I think is similar to this and that I worked on, and a lot of the polling was off, especially early on, because quite frankly we didn't have models to contend for what we saw in the surge of voting among especially young people and people of color, because they had something to vote for. And I think that's really critical. So I don't want to dismiss the joy, because the joy is important. Yeah. Because you have to give these young people something to vote for. And what you're seeing in the polls is, look, when you give them something to vote for, their enthusiasm changes. And look at poll after poll, and certainly it's sort of our internal polling that we do for Black PAC of large samples of African Americans, we've seen the motivation and the levels of importance, you know, triple, right, in some areas with certain cohorts of African Americans. And look, African American women right now are as excited to vote as I've seen them in the polling since 2008. So the joy is important, and it helps sort of the enthusiasm and the mobilization. So then it comes to turnout, right? Take a state like North Carolina. Like I saw a poll in North Carolina last week where it is tied, right? It is a dead heat in North Carolina. The last time I saw a Democrat in a dead heat in North Carolina at the top of the ticket was 2008, and we won that. Yeah. And we won that because of turnout and enthusiasm. So that joy is important.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's talk about the other side. You know, Hugo, you are following what the Trump campaign is doing, because their campaign is not highly visible. But, you know, back when I was in politics and not in media, I worked on a campaign where we didn't see the George W. Bush campaign. They were not visible, but they surely won, right? Because they had sort of an outreach into places that you weren't going to see. They weren't necessarily knocking doors. They were, at that time, getting senior citizens and senior voters to turn out mail-in ballots, which now they're against. What are they doing, and how organized are they on the ground, the Trump campaign?
Yeah, it's a really interesting point that you raise, because, you know, we have also heard a lot of the same in places like Pennsylvania, right? The state that both sides really need to win in trying to take the Electoral College. And we were speaking to a lot of local Republicans, and they were alarmed because they thought the Trump campaign's presence was really, really small for presidential. In fact, they were comparing it to us as more something akin to a midterm election. And so we went back and looked at the numbers. For a midterm election, the RNC in 2022 had about 50 paid staffers on the ground. And that is obviously lower than the RNC's projection for 2024 for this presidential cycle, when they were looking at roughly kind of 88 to 90 staffers on the ground. We are told by the Trump campaign that they have more than 50, but they won't tell us exactly what the numbers are. And, you know, that's always a tell, because if they were proud about the numbers, they would tell you, they would boast about it. And then when we went to the Harris campaign, what we heard was there were 375 staffers in Pennsylvania alone. So that is one massive advantage. And the Harris campaign has, as of right now, going into the election with respect to the ground game. Now, the difference this time around is that the Trump campaign is relying on a bunch of outside super PACs to basically do their get out the vote initiatives. So we looked there as well, and actually what we found was it's very, very disjointed. Yes, they have data sharing agreements with the Trump campaign, but they've only recently started hiring staff to go, you know, knock on doors, to do canvassing, and that's a real major problem for the Trump campaign, because when you're doing it this late in the race, what it means is you haven't had repeated voter contacts, which is what you need to get people to cast a ballot, and you also get low quality people who, you know, really don't want the job because it's a 2-month thing where you're knocking on doors in the heat. And I think if you look at it in its totality, the Trump campaign's ground game, especially in Pennsylvania, you don't see it, not because they're doing it really well and they're hiding it, but really because it doesn't really exist.
Yeah, fascinating. And the other thing they're doing, that is fascinating information. The other piece of it is Amy, what they're doing, the Trump team seems to be doing a lot of its work on social media. Trump going on these outre, right-wing podcasts, all these young right-wing sort of, incel kings. But also, Semaphore has got this story. The organizers of a mysterious network paid influencers to promote sexual smears of Vice President Harris as Democrats rallied around her to be their presidential candidate in late July. Now, we've heard even some former journalists playing this game, but this is like a network. The network that would push the sexual smears began with more run-of-the-mill Republican talking points, but it was unusual in one way. A person who participated in his video call said none of the participants identified themselves by name, and they all joined calls with their cameras off to preserve their mutual anonymity. Misogyny is playing a big role, Amy, in the strategy on the other side of people smearing the candidate in this way. Your thoughts?
Absolutely. Yeah. Here's what we know about the way in which in the electoral space, women are defeated. This kind of misinformation and disinformation that's based on, kind of sexual lies and the specific kind of combination of attacks on race and gender, misogynoir that we see sexualized is a way that people can spread misinformation. But I think that the thing we have to stay focused on in the midst of growing disinformation that we're going to see is that the Kamala Harris campaign needs to focus above and beyond all of this, all these attacks on the core voters. We have to talk to the base. And it can seem very overwhelming when you see stuff on social media, you see things that are lies, you see people attempting to cut down the validity of Kamala Harris's leadership and of the campaign.
Yeah.
And so what we have to focus on in the last 8 weeks is the very voters who are going to make a tremendous difference and who made the difference in 2020, getting Harris and Biden into office in the first place.
Right.
And that's Black and brown voters.
Cornell Belcher, indeed, Cornell Belcher, Hugo Lowell, Amy Allison, thank you all very much. We'll bring you all back to talk about this stuff more. Thank you.
My entire life, I've been very apolitical. Not only, of course, required because I was a active duty general and also a National Guard officer. It's something where ever since 2016, where I've seen what Trump has done, how he has treated people, how he has dealt with crises, I've been just absolutely opposed to such a very dictatorial, strongman, bully type of a leader. And so it was easy for me to add my name to this list of those 10 officers and NCOs.
Hi again, everybody. It's 5 o'clock in New York now. We're at a remarkable and unprecedented point in our history and our politics. The staunchest of conservatives are coming out and announcing their plans to vote for a Democratic candidate for president. And the kinds of people who usually remain steadfastly apolitical are being driven to speak out of their sense of duty to the country. That was retired Major General Randy Manner, one of 10 retired generals and admirals who just signed on to an extraordinary letter calling the ex-president and current GOP nominee a danger to our national security and our democracy. These men and women who served our nation in high-ranking positions are emphatically endorsing Vice President Kamala Harris, calling her, quote, the best and only presidential candidate in this race who is fit to serve as our commander-in-chief. They underscore Harris's record this way, quote, she has demonstrated her ability to take on the most difficult national security challenges in the Situation Room and on the international stage, from rallying our allies against Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine to standing shoulder to shoulder with our allies in the Indo-Pacific against China's provocative actions, to advancing U.S. leadership on space and artificial intelligence. She is a steadfast supporter of service members, veterans, their families, their caregivers, and survivors, as opposed to her opponent, about whom they say this, quote, at his core, he does not understand selfless service and sacrifice, and he should never be allowed to again serve as commander-in-chief of the greatest fighting force in the world. Meanwhile, someone who understands service and sacrifice on a very personal level, Gold Star father Kaiser Khan says the danger a Trump presidency poses now is even greater than 4 years ago. Listen.
In 234-year history of United States, there had not been a president or vice president convicted of felony charges. Here we have Donald Trump, and that is where I say that in 4 years it has gotten worse. Donald Trump is convicted of 34 felonies, and he owes $554 million fine, monetary fine, that he still owes. It has gotten worse, and he has announced it in his own words that I will be a dictator on day one.
As we alluded to at the top, the appeal of the current vice president has become so far-reaching that former Vice President Dick Cheney and his daughter, former Congresswoman Liz Cheney, are throwing their support behind the Democratic ticket for the first time in their lives. To them, there's only one candidate who puts this country first.
If you look at Vice President Harris's speech, for example, at the Democratic convention, it is a speech that Ronald Reagan could have given. It's a speech that George Bush could have given. It's very much an embrace and an understanding of the exceptional nature of this great nation, a love of America, a recognition that America is a special place.
It's where we start the hour with some of our favorite experts and friends. Retired U.S. Army Brigadier General Steve Anderson is here with us. He is one of the senior military officials who signed that letter backing Vice President Harris. Also joining us, former Republican Congressman, MSNBC political analyst David Jolly's here, and we convinced Claire McCaskill to stick around. General, I start with you. We've been talking about what the media can do a better job at, and it is because when folks like yourself come out and step into politics, it's extraordinary. And there's a flattening of 9 years of Trump that makes it difficult to articulate what a big deal it is for all of you who signed this letter to speak out. Can you put some of that in context for us?
Well, thank you, Nicole. It's really an honor to be here. I just simply got to highlight what you said about how exceptional this moment is. I mean, I'm a retired Army general officer, 31 years. I never in my entire career knew the party of my boss or any of my people, whether they're Democrat, Republican, Independent, whatever. I didn't know. I didn't care. OK, but all of that changed for so many of us on the 6th of January. We saw what was going on. We saw the insurrection. We saw the leadership that's being provided, and really the evil intent of Donald Trump to try to destroy our democracy and overturn an election. That caused many of us, such as myself, and you had Major General Randy Manner on earlier, a great friend of mine, and so many, the 10 signatories of this letter. And I will tell you, there's 500 folks on the National Security Leaders for America, run by Admiral Mike Smith. All of us share this incredible love for our country and our concern on what's going on. And all of us have decided the time has come now to take action. I mean, what happens, you know, if you go back 90 years and you look at what happened in Germany, how did the Nazis rise to power? It's because good people didn't take action. They were silent. They didn't step up, you know, and I talked to many of my colleagues who wish to remain on the sidelines, and I said, okay, got it, understand that. But if not now, when? I mean, are we going to wait for the jackboots to go marching down the street and the brown shirts to get rolled out and our kids signed up for, you know, Trump Youth or whatever? I mean, when do we actually step forward? So that's why we wrote this letter. We thought the time has come. We need to support Kamala Harris for many of the reasons that were just articulated in your opening segment. The comments from Liz Cheney and, of course, Adam Kinzinger at the Democratic National Convention and whatnot. I mean, we need to ensure that Donald Trump never again sets foot in the Oval Office. And perhaps the most compelling testimony to that fact is that so many of his advisors and staffers and people that served in administration, like 98%, not only won't support him, won't vote for him, but they consider him to be a threat to national security and totally unfit for office. Now is the time to step forward. So that's why I and so many of my fellow general officers, admirals, and ambassadors senior leaders. That's why we have come forward and we're saying, hey, look, America, please listen to us. We know what we're talking about here. I mean, I was in Afghanistan from 2016 to 2018. I saw what Donald Trump was doing over there. And I'll tell you, we've got to make sure that that man never again sets foot in the Oval Office.
When you look at what he did around January 6th, his goal was to have the U.S. military seize voting machines. And it wasn't a law that stopped him, and it sure as hell won't be a second time now that the Supreme Court gave him absolute immunity for official acts. What is he capable of doing to the military without someone like General Milley or without any men or women who say no?
Well, the problem in the military right now is that there's extremism that we've got to sort out, and we've got to, I mean, there's no place for extremism in the military, be it right, be it left, whatever. You know, and Donald Trump is trying to tap into that. And I certainly expect that in the next administration, he will declare the Insurrection Act or whatever. He will try to mobilize the military to take down his political enemies. He'll try to mobilize the legal system. You know, the Attorney General's office. Not only will he try to wipe out all the felony convictions against him and all those other felony charges that are still pending, but he will try to use the legal system to take down his political enemies as well. So, I mean, we just cannot let that happen. And so we've got to stand up right now, speak up, and say, look, enough's enough. We need to get somebody that's competent, who's professional, who treats others with dignity and respect, who brings optimism and joy and focus, who's trying to, and hope. She's trying to push America forward. Whereas Donald Trump, he wants to wallow in grievances and hatred and prejudice and revisit, you know, transgressions from the past and try to take out his political enemies. And it's just shocking what's going on. We cannot let that happen.
What is the private conversation among military families like around Trump really believing and saying out loud that anyone who serves the country and dies or is injured is a, quote, sucker and loser? That's according to his former chief of staff, General Kelly.
Yeah, John Kelly, a great man, a great leader, and so many people like him have spoken out in similar type stories. I mean, it's shocking. It's terrible. I mean, we know that he doesn't understand selfless service in the least. He's never done anything his entire life for anybody other than Donald Trump. Look at Kamala Harris. She served as Attorney General in California, state senator for 4 years. She's been the vice president. She's passed up millions and millions of dollars to be a high-speed lawyer, which she could be, because she's incredibly talented and capable. She's doing that because she loves our country. She's here to fight for Americans. She came up middle class, just like her superb vice president pick, former Command Sergeant Major Tim Waltz, by the way. I mean, these people understand America. They come from middle America. They're going to push this. They know what we need. They know what we want. They know how to really to push this country in the direction we need to go and not take it backwards like Donald Trump wants.
With the debate just hours away, the former president has ramped up his threats to jail political opponents if he wins the election. Our own Vaughn Hilliard has the details.
Tonight, as he prepares for his critical debate showdown, former President Trump vowing to totally reshape the Justice Department and target political opponents.
We will completely overhaul Kamala's corrupt Department of Injustice.
He recently reposted doctored images of top Democrats, along with Anthony Fauci and Bill Gates in orange jumpsuits with the caption, "How to Actually Fix the System." And in Trump's new book, alleging Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg will try to unlawfully influence the 2024 election, writing, "If he does anything illegal, this time he will spend the rest of his life in prison." Just this weekend, Trump promising possible retribution against 2024 election administrators, writing, "Lawyers, political operatives, donors, illegal voters, and corrupt election officials, those involved in unscrupulous behavior, will be sought out, caught, and prosecuted at levels unfortunately never seen before in our country." But illegal voting is rare, and tonight, a Republican election official in Arizona told us he's worried.
I'm concerned. We will see potentially professionals who are more willing to bend general rules of prosecutorial ethics or legal standards, who will occupy these positions.
This summer's consequential Supreme Court ruling also gave a president absolute immunity over anything he orders or says to his attorney general. Though Trump's GOP supporters argue that DOJ and Democratic prosecutors are going after him to hurt his campaign.
My poll numbers, I believe, are higher now because the public understands it's a hoax.
You believe. Let's discuss this and more with former Democratic Senator Doug Jones of Alabama and Stuart Stevens, a veteran of the Mitt Romney and George W. Bush presidential campaigns. He is now with the Lincoln Project. Stuart, are people taking these threats seriously enough?
No, well, they're not. There is this reluctance to accept what Trump is saying. And look, I think the majority of the blame lies with my old party. You know, these Republican senators and governors and elected officials who are supporting Trump, they know there's not election fraud. If there was election fraud, what are they doing being elected? How does it work now? It's so... They know this, and yet they're remaining silent about it. And this is a system that is based upon goodwill and faith. A lot of our elections are conducted by volunteers who are doing a civic duty. And what Trump is doing is just sort of old-fashioned voter intimidation, which, Doug Jones knows more about that, having seen it in Alabama, than most folks.
Doug, what do you think? Can he actually do this?
Well, look, if he gets elected and he does what Project 2025 says about the Justice Department, he can do it because he will control those levers of power. And Congress will not do anything. Congress will be ill-equipped to try to stop him to do those kind of things. What's interesting about this, Stephanie, is, back in the summer when Project 2025 all of a sudden started getting a lot of publicity and the people in this country started seeing it for what it is, a danger and a threat to democracy, Donald Trump tried to distance himself from it. Oh, I don't have a clue what that is. There's some bad stuff in there. I'm not going to have anything to do with it. Well, what he is now describing about the Justice Department and retribution and prosecuting is exactly what's in Project 2025. And people need to understand that and so much more that's in that project because it's a danger. And yes, if he has the ability, he will direct the Justice Department to do exactly what he wants to do, to go after whoever. If you read some of the most recent literature, he tried to do that in his first term. And was not successful, but he tried to do that in his first term.
Stuart, let's talk about the latest viral outrage from the right, separate from the one I talked about in our last segment, the lies about migrants in an apartment complex in Colorado. This one is being pushed from people like Elon Musk, Stephen Miller, and even the VP candidate, J.D. Vance himself. They're all pushing these baseless claims that migrants are killing and eating pets in Springfield, Ohio. And now, sure enough, Donald Trump is trying to campaign on it. So let's set the record straight. For fact's sake, this is completely false. We're going to slow down and explain it to our audience. The Springfield Police Department released a statement saying, quote, there have been no credible reports or specific claims of pets being harmed, injured, or abused by individuals within the immigrant community. Stuart, this is insane, but these things are being pushed. I saw Bill Ackman, who's a professional investor, who does due diligence for a living, who wouldn't give $1 to a business that he didn't research himself. He's tweeting this garbage out. But the worry is these scare tactics, they work.
Yeah, they do work. Look, I think we're seeing the whole American experiment really being challenged here. There's a question here. What does it mean to be an American? Are we going to go along with this? And when you see these vastly wealthy people like Ackerman, who only could have become wealthy like that in an American system, and they're so anxious to change the American system that made them, would they rather be CEOs in Russia? Because that's where Trump's headed. If you don't please him, he's going to come after you. And if Ackerman or any of these people think that they're exempt from that, just wait until they try to cross Donald Trump on something, and they will come after him. But, you know, at the heart of the whole Trumpism is fear. This party that I joined with Ronald Reagan standing up in front of the Berlin Wall saying, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. It was optimistic. It was bold. It was everybody had won life's lottery if you were born an American or became an American. And now it's a party that is driven by fear. People of these imaginary demons that are out there. And I think it's so sad because most people don't wake up in the morning fearful, and yet this has taken over this party, and it's incredibly disturbing.
Doug, we hear all of these complaints all the time about big tech, and big tech is in the tank for Democrats. It's totally biased. But let's get to the truth, because here you have Elon Musk, the owner of Twitter, which has enormous reach. He himself has endorsed Donald Trump. And day in and day out, he is pushing misinformation, disinformation, and allowing it to run rampant on his platform. How does any of this square?
It doesn't square. The only problem is that we have a First Amendment, and he has a lot of money, and he's got that platform and can do whatever the hell he wants to do. That's the bottom line. He's got millions of followers. He's got billions of dollars. He has put it all into that one platform. And unfortunately, for at least right now, that's the only town square, that's the only platform that's out there that gets anything other than the young folks on TikTok. And these things, and look, Stephanie, you're going to see more and more of this. I mean, I got asked the other day about a potential October surprise. If there is an October surprise, I believe it's going to be something that Elon Musk will make up and just put out there. It will not be based on fact. It will be these kind of false narratives, everything that they possibly can to drive people away from Kamala Harris. And that's the real sad thing. The story about eating the pets is typical, I think. And Stuart is absolutely right. It is playing on a fear and a stereotype. Coming from the South, I can tell you I've seen so many politicians play on people's fears and stereotypes about minorities, immigrants, and others. And that's exactly what this is about. And in fact, the only thing I've seen about maybe eating a pet was the picture of Robert F. Kennedy, the new surrogate for Trump, eating a goat or a dog or something like that.